Hello, everyone. We're going to be talking about the United States Constitutional Convention. And the problems with the Articles of the Confederation led many political leaders to conclude the United States needed a new form of government. So we've already talked several times about how the Articles of Confederation did not work, just was not a good system of government. So they want to plan a meeting, and a convention is a meeting, and a convention was called to draft the U.S. Constitution. And the U.S. Constitution, that's the government we have today. And both George Washington and James Madison of Virginia played important roles in the Constitutional Convention. And at this convention, George Washington was the president of the convention. He later on becomes president of the United States, but right now he is just president of the convention. And he presided the convention, and although seldom participating in debates, lent his enormous prestige to the proceedings. Washington was a general for the military during the French and Indian War, and also during the Revolution, so a lot of people respected him, so it was important that he was there. Another important person at the Constitutional Convention was James Madison, and he's often referred to as the father of the Constitution, and he was a brilliant political philosopher. He led debates and kept copious notes of the proceedings. The best record historians have what transpired at the Constitutional Convention. So he just took a lot of notes there, and a lot of people today can read his notes so they know what happened at this convention. And at the convention, he authored the Virginia Plan, which proposed a federal government of three separate branches: the legislative branch, the executive branch, and judicial branch, and became the foundation for the structure of the new government. So this is the idea of separation of powers. There's three different branches that he proposed for the government. Legislative is Congress, executive is where the president is, and judicial is where the judges are and Supreme Court justices. And he later authored much of the Bill of Rights, and the Bill of Rights are rights that every person in the United States has, and he authored that, and we'll go more into the Bill of Rights another time. So there were some issues with the Constitution, and they needed some resolutions. And unlike the Articles of the Confederation, the Constitution made federal law the supreme law of the land when constitutional, but otherwise gave the states considerable leeway to govern themselves. So essentially, those states have to follow federal law. If there's a federal law, every state in the country has to follow it. They have no option. But if there's no law, then states can make whatever laws they want. They're free to do anything they want. But they do have to follow federal law. Next, we're going to learn about some compromises. There was something called the Virginia Plan, which we talked about before. The Virginia Plan called for representation of the legislative branch, which is Congress, to be based on the population of each state. So if a state had more people, they'd have more representation. However, there was something called the New Jersey Plan, which the smaller states wanted, and smaller states did not want representation based on population. They wanted to continue having the same amount of representation regardless of population. So remember the Articles of Confederation, every state had one vote, no matter the size, and the small states like New Jersey, they wanted to continue having that, so they came up with the New Jersey Plan. So they created a compromise, and it's known as the Great Compromise. And for this, they used parts of the Virginia Plan and parts of the New Jersey Plan. And it balanced power between larger states and small states by creating a Senate and a House of Representatives. So there's a Senate and a House of Representatives in Congress, and for the Senate, every state has two members regardless of size. So New Jersey has two senators, California has two senators, Montana has two senators, Texas has two senators, Virginia has two senators. It doesn't matter the state, it has two senators. Population doesn't matter. But they also created the House of Representatives, and membership is based on the state's population. More people equals more representation. So it just depends on how big a state is. So New York has more people than Virginia, so New York is going to have more representatives in the House of Representatives. But this was to keep both the big states happy and the small states happy. They created the Great Compromise. There is something also with checks and balances. Some people were afraid the federal government would be too powerful. They didn't want to be like England, which had a strong federal government. However, some people wanted the federal government to have more power. Under the Articles of Confederation, the federal government had no power, so some people wanted to give it more power. That's why they created a system of checks and balances. And a too powerful federal government was prevented by creating 3 separate branches of government: legislative, executive, judicial, which provided several checks and balances and separation of power. So when you see checks and balances, it's just referring to the separation of power, because each branch can do something to stop another branch. All right, and the last compromise we're going to talk about is called the Three-Fifths Compromise. So if you remember, if you have a higher population, you have more representatives, which means you have more say in the government. However, northern states where they do not have slavery, they did not want the slaves in the southern states to count towards the population of the state. The southern states wanted slaves to count towards their population so they would have more representatives. But the northern states didn't like that. African Americans were not allowed to vote. The southern states only wanted them to count because they wanted more representation. So the Three-Fifths Compromise was created. And a compromise was created in which African Americans would count as 3/5 of a person when counting towards the population when determining representation. So for every 5 African Americans, it would only count towards 3 in the population. But the southern states said yes to this because they did want more representation, and the northern states, they compromised because they didn't want there to be a higher population so they'd have more representation. All right, if you guys have any questions, let me know. Stuff's pretty hard. We're going to continue working with it, and just let me know if you need help.